was a kid, one of my heroes was a guy named Bob Riggle, because he had a car that could do something nobody else's car could do.
Jay Leno's collection has grown to well over 180 vehicles. And yet if you stopped a die-hard fan of his show and asked them to rattle off 5 cars from memory, most would run out of names after 3. That isn't a coincidence. And it isn't because the collection lacks variety. It's because tucked between the household names, the McLarens, the Duesenbergs, the cars everyone expects a garage like this to hold, sit a handful of machines so unusual that even people who have watched hundreds of episodes have scrolled right past them without registering what they were actually looking at. Some of these cars represent entire companies that no longer exist. One of them technically shouldn't exist at all, because the manufacturer tried to destroy almost every copy it built. Today we're pulling those cars out of the shadows of Leno's garage and giving them the attention they've been missing. Most engines rumble when you fire them up. This one doesn't. It starts with a low whine that climbs and climbs, the same rising pitch you'd hear from a jet spooling up before takeoff, because that's essentially what's happening under the hood. This is Jay Leno's Chrysler turbine car, and it's one of the strangest experiments an American car company ever tried to sell to the public. Back in the 1960s, Chrysler wasn't just tinkering with turbine technology in a lab. They built 55 running examples and handed the keys to ordinary families across the country. The idea was simple in theory. Find out whether a jet-style turbine engine could realistically replace the piston engine that had powered cars for decades. Roughly 200 households got to drive one of these things to work, to the grocery store, wherever they normally went, just so Chrysler could gather honest feedback from real drivers instead of engineers. The response was largely positive. People liked them. And then Chrysler destroyed 46 of the 55 cars anyway. Part of the reason was financial. The Italian-built bodies were subject to steep import tariffs, and crushing the cars sidestepped that cost entirely. Part of it was that turbine technology, however novel, never penciled out as something Chrysler could mass-produce profitably. Whatever the reasoning, only 9 of the original 55 survived that purge, and today only 5 of those 9 can still be started and driven. Leno's connection to this car goes back to childhood. He first saw one in person as a teenager at the 1964 World's Fair, watching it loop around a display track over and over until he simply couldn't tear himself away. It took decades, but he eventually tracked one down and made it his own. The styling came from designer Elwood Engel, while the bodies themselves were hand-built across the Atlantic by the Italian coach builder Ghia. The engine was almost comically adaptable. It could run on diesel, on kerosene, and even, according to Leno himself, on tequila. For years, Leno drove his turbine car like any other vehicle in rotation. Then the aircraft-grade turbine seized up entirely, turning a 60-year-old car with almost no part supply into a very expensive ornament. Getting it running again meant calling in Williams International, a company founded by the same engineer who built the original turbine. And it took the firm's current leader pulling together roughly 60 veterans of the original program just to resurrect one engine. When it's running, that engine idles around 22,000 RPM and can rev past 44,000, with operating temperatures that can climb past 1,300 degrees before real damage sets in. It isn't a museum piece sitting under glass. It's a genuinely functioning piece of Cold War-era engineering that happens to have a steering wheel bolted to it. If a turbine car is at least somewhat known among serious fans, the next car on this list is almost completely invisible. And that invisibility is the entire point of its design. Picture a Ford Festiva from the late 1980s, small, cheap, forgettable, exactly the kind of subcompact nobody has ever stopped to photograph. Now imagine 2 men deciding that car deserved a heart transplant. Chuck Beck had already built a career around the Ford GT40's Le Mans pit crew, and had once managed to stuff a Lamborghini V12 into a motorcycle frame, just to see if he could. His partner, Rick Titus, was a racing driver who'd recently spent time behind the wheel of the Ford RS 200, one of the most extreme rally cars ever built, and came away wondering why nobody had ever built an American answer to it. Together they landed on an idea. Got the tiny factory engine out of a Festiva and replace it with the 220 horsepower Yamaha-engineered V6 from a Ford Taurus SHO, mounting it behind the seats and sending power to the rear wheels instead of the front. exactly the opposite of how the car left the factory. They called the result the Ford Shogun, and from the outside it looks precisely like the Econobox it started life as: no wing, no flared fenders, nothing to tip off a passerby. Beck and Titus originally hoped to build as many as 250 of them under their company, Special Editions, betting that there was a market for a boutique American exotic disguised as a grocery getter. Reality had other plans. Each finished car cost around $42,000 in 1990, nearly $80,000 in today's money, and persuading buyers to spend that kind of money on what looked like a modified economy car proved almost impossible. By the time production quietly wound down, only 7 customer cars and a single prototype existed, 8 total. Leno owns chassis number 3 and has had it since it was new. The numbers are the part that stop people cold. It weighs barely a ton, hits 60 miles an hour in about 4.6 seconds, and clears the quarter mile in under 13 seconds, figures that a contemporary Porsche 911 couldn't match, despite the Shogun costing a fraction of the price. Leno later bolted on a nitrous oxide system of his own, pushing an already ridiculous car even further beyond what its shape suggests it's capable of. And somehow it kept its factory air conditioning, its leather racing seats, and a Momo steering wheel. Small comforts wedged into a car nobody was ever supposed to take seriously. It might be the purest sleeper in his entire collection, precisely because nothing about its appearance hints at what's happening underneath. Not everything in Leno's garage tries to blend in. Some of it goes the opposite direction entirely, built to look like nothing else on the road. Designer Randy Grubb has spent years building vehicles that sit somewhere between transportation and rolling sculpture, and nowhere is that clearer than in his creations known as Decopods. Grubb and Leno's relationship stretches back more than a decade, beginning when Leno purchased Grubb's wildly unconventional Blastoline Special, a build so distinctive that Leno nicknamed it his tank car. When Grubb decided to build something new, he didn't repeat the formula. He started with ordinary Piaggio scooters, a 2-wheeled fly model, and a 3-wheeled MP3, and reimagined them completely by hand. The finished Decopods are low, bullet-shaped, and unmistakably Art Deco, the kind of thing a 1930s science fiction illustrator might have sketched for a spaceship. Grubb has openly described the inspiration as something out of a Flash Gordon comic, and the construction backs that up. He stripped roughly 25 pounds of factory plastic bodywork off each scooter and replaced it with hand-formed aluminum panels, riveted together the old-fashioned way, ending up barely heavier than what they replaced. Underneath the sculpted shell, the scooter mechanics remain fully functional. The Decopods can still lean into corners like a normal scooter and top out near 70 miles an hour, and Grubb maintains that the enclosed, aerodynamic shape actually cuts down on the crosswind buffeting that used to plague old, enclosed racing motorcycles. Only a small handful were ever produced across 2 variants, and Leno owns 2 of the earliest examples built. They don't fit neatly into any category. Not a muscle car, not a luxury car, not even really a conventional street machine. Their rolling design experiments built one at a time by a single craftsman working out of Grants Pass, Oregon, and that's exactly why Leno keeps them around. Strange shapes are one kind of invisibility. Complete ordinariness is another, and it's arguably more effective at hiding a car in plain sight. Somewhere in Leno's collection sits a Cunningham C3, a coupe from a company that most Americans today couldn't identify even if you handed them the badge. Briggs Cunningham, an heir to a meatpacking fortune, spent years and a significant chunk of that fortune chasing something no American had managed before, winning the 24 Hours of Le Mans with an American car driven by an American. In 1952, race organizers changed the entry rules and told him that competing as a manufacturer required building 25 road legal cars first. Cunningham had never planned on running an actual car company, but he built one anyway, out of a factory in West Palm Beach, Florida, pairing a modified racing chassis with a Chrysler Hemi V8 that could push the car from a standstill to 60 miles an hour in around 7 seconds, with a top speed near 150. Building the cars entirely on American soil turned out to be too expensive, so completed chassis were shipped across the Atlantic to the Italian coach builder Vignale, finished according to a design from Giovanni Michelotti, and shipped back to the United States for sale. Each car took nearly 2 months of handwork to complete, and the finished product cost somewhere between $9,000 and $11,000 at a time when a Cadillac could be had for roughly a third of that price. Production ended with exactly 25 cars built, 5 open cabriolets, and 20 coupes, and the design impressed enough people that the Museum of Modern Art named it one of the 10 best contemporary automobile designs of 1953. Cunningham's team never actually won at Le Mans, but they came remarkably close, finishing third overall in both 1953 and 1954, an extraordinary result for a tiny American outfit going up against factory-backed teams from Ferrari and Jaguar. The company never had the production volume or marketing budget to build a lasting following, and today most car enthusiasts would walk right past a C3 without a second look. Leno doesn't keep it because it's the fastest or most famous thing in the building. He keeps it because it represents an entire chapter of ambitious American engineering that never got the recognition it deserved. The theme of brilliant engineering that history quietly forgot comes back around, and this time it arrives with another turbine bolted where a normal engine would go. Long after Chrysler shelved its original turbine program, a completely separate turbine project began the same way many of Leno's most unusual builds start, as a rough idea sketched on a napkin. This particular conversation happened between Leno and Bernard Jutchley, the longtime chief mechanic who manages his garage on a day-to-day basis. Jutchley pitched the concept to Ed Welburn, who at the time was General Motors' vice president of global design, and within roughly 2 weeks, GM's advanced design studio in North Hollywood had turned those rough sketches into an actual shape, borrowing visual language from fighter jets and Formula One cars. The finished result, named the EcoJet, made its debut at the 2006 SEMA show in Las Vegas. Built around a modified Corvette Z06 hydroformed aluminum frame and wrapped in a body made of carbon fiber layered over Kevlar. Tucked beneath that body sits a Honeywell LT-101 turbine, the same engine used in Bell 222 helicopters and in United States Coast Guard rescue helicopters, producing somewhere around 650 horsepower. It runs primarily on biodiesel, with a small secondary tank of jet fuel reserved specifically to help the engine start before the system switches over to the main fuel source. Fuel economy is a running joke Leno tells on himself. The EcoJet manages something in the neighborhood of 6 miles per gallon, which means it's really only practical to drive right after a good harvest. On paper, the car is theoretically capable of speeds approaching 245 miles an hour, though in practice it exists purely as a demonstration piece. Proof that turbine power could still deliver serious performance decades after Chrysler's original experiment quietly faded away. Set the 2 turbine cars side by side, and you're looking at a 40-year conversation between 2 completely different generations of engineers, both chasing the same unconventional idea, both ultimately abandoned by an industry that never found a practical use for it. Most people who watch Leno's show remember the McLarens and the Lamborghinis. Almost nobody remembers that his garage quietly holds 2 separate attempts, built decades apart, at putting a jet engine into a road car. And turbines aren't the only extinct technology parked in that building. Entire car brands went extinct too, and several of them are sitting only a few feet away. Walk further into the collection, and the badges start disappearing from memory even faster than the engines do. There's a Wills St. Clair built by a man named C. Harold Wills, who was far from an outsider dabbling in the car business. Wills was one of Henry Ford's earliest employees, credited with developing the nickel-chrome vanadium steel used in the Model T's chassis, and he even hand-lettered the script that became Ford's blue oval emblem. Wills left the company a multi-millionaire in 1919 and used that fortune to build cars under his own name in Marysville, Michigan, powered by an overhead cam V8 that cooled itself without needing a water pump. The company produced somewhere between 12 and 14,000 cars before folding, and only around 80 are believed to survive today. Leno's example spent decades locked inside a shipping container out in the desert before it was rescued and brought back to life. There's also an NSU Spider, the first rotary engine car ever sold to the public, built by a small German manufacturer years before Mazda made the Wankel engine a household name. Only 2,375 were produced between 1964 and 1967, each one making a modest 54 horsepower from an engine tucked below the rear trunk. NSU eventually bet the company's entire future on a larger rotary-powered sedan. The same rotor seal problems that had plagued the Spider caught up with them at a much larger scale, and the brand was eventually absorbed into what became Audi. And there's a Jensen CV8, a British Grand Tourer, that paired a big, lazy American Chrysler V8 with a fiberglass body mounted over steel doors, plus adjustable shocks that sound more like science fiction than 1960s engineering. Only around 500 were built between 1962 and 1966, and the model has spent decades living in the shadow of its more famous successor, the Jensen Interceptor. None of these three brands survives today in any meaningful form. Each one represents a company that tried something genuinely different and ultimately lost the business fight anyway. The very last car on this list proves that sometimes the rarest secrets hide inside the most recognizable badges, not the most obscure ones. The Mercedes-Benz 600 was never a normal luxury sedan to begin with. Every window, the sunroof, the seats, even the trunk lid operate on a complex hydraulic system instead of ordinary electric motors. And the car was engineered in the 1960s and 1970s with almost no regard for cost. That made it the most expensive car in the world at launch, priced above even a Rolls-Royce of the same era. And it became the default choice for heads of state, business tycoons, and more than a few authoritarian rulers, with famous owners including John Lennon and Elvis Presley. The engineering underneath is almost comically overbuilt. Mercedes gave the 600 a full steel body bolted to a steel chassis so rigid that jacking up one corner of the car would lift both tires on that side clean off the ground. Fully equipped, it weighed more than 5,000 pounds, yet its 6.3-liter V8 could still push it to a top speed of around 130 miles an hour. Only a small number of exotic variants ever left the factory. A landaulet with a convertible rear section for parade duty, a stretched Pullman limousine with extra rear-facing seats, and a fully armored version built in-house for customers who needed one. Only around 138 examples of the 600 were ever brought into the United States at all, which makes finding one on American soil rare enough on its own, long before anyone even thinks about modifying it. Leno has said this is his personal favorite car in the entire collection, a preference that traces back to his teenage years working at a Mercedes dealership, where delivering one of these cars across the country felt like the height of luxury. Mercedes never offered a supercharged version of the 600 from the factory, but Leno's 1972 example has one anyway, built by Karl Mittelhoff, a specialist restorer known specifically for his work on this model, who fitted the stock 6.3-liter V8 with fuel injection and a supercharger that pushes output from roughly 300 horsepower up to around 525. As far as anyone can determine, that makes it the only supercharged Mercedes-Benz 600 in existence anywhere in the world. Leno has joked about once spooking an older Iranian man who assumed he was being tailed by the Shah's secret police, a reminder of just how tightly this particular car is tied to an era of strongmen who once favored it. Restoring one of these cars is notoriously punishing work. A single window switch on an original 600 can cost thousands of dollars to replace, and the hydraulic system that controls nearly every function in the car is widely considered among the hardest systems in the world to service correctly, part of why so few owners actually dare to drive theirs regularly. Leno drives his anyway. More than anything else on this list, that habit captures what makes his garage genuinely different from a typical car museum. A museum protects rarity behind glass and expects visitors to admire it from a distance. Leno starts the engines. He drives the turbine cars, the disguised Fords, the vanished brands, and even a Mercedes that technically shouldn't exist. And he treats every one of them the same way he treats his most famous machines, as tools built to be understood, not simply displayed. The real story hiding inside this collection was never about which car is worth the most money. It's about how many genuinely remarkable machines can sit in plain sight for years, parked a few feet from icons everyone recognizes, before anyone actually stops to notice what they're looking at.